listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. I'm joined today by Matt Shapo. He is the Director of Digital Audio and Video at the IAB. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So I should know this, but how long have you been in the podcast industry now?
It's a good question. So I've been at IAB for a little over 3 years, but in some respects, you could say I've been in the podcast industry for as much as 10 to 15 years. I worked almost 20 years at a place called the All Access Music Group right before I came to IAB. And All Access, as you may know, was a business-to-business online publication that was very focused on reporting news, gossip, data, information, everything related to the radio and the record industries. And as you might imagine, when I started, that was primarily an experience of coverage where over-the-air terrestrial radio was concerned. But obviously, as audio began its transformation into the digital realm, we began to sort of track, report on, cover that transformation process that was occurring from terrestrial into digital audio. That included not just podcasting, obviously included music streaming, online radio, but increasingly as podcasting really took off like the rocket ship that it is today, it became an area of practice for me. I used to write a weekly column there where we do sort of like a roundup of all the stuff that we had put on the site that week. We had a bunch of news and a bunch of columns, and increasingly it was all about podcasting, as you might expect. And so I sort of carried that coverage with me into the audio practice here at IAB, where I'm also not entirely focused on podcasting, but it's a big coverage area for me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. So I feel like, to me, podcasting and IAB go hand in hand. When I started in 2016, everything was hunky-dory. And then in 2017, when the IAB came out with their new standards, it was like the industry kind of like took a step back because the IAB reevaluated the way that downloads were being calculated. And it was just such a huge adjustment, which it was a correction that was needed. And then I have leaned very heavily on the IAB's podcast advertising report that they put out every year, which I think is an amazing piece. But can you tell me what exactly is the IAB's role within the podcast space?
Yeah, that's another good question. I'll start just where you started. I'll start with the technical download standards that you mentioned. That sort of, the entire creation of that standard occurred well before my arrival here. But obviously, since I've gotten here, I've spent a great deal of time sort of coming up to speed on the usage of it and working hand in hand with the folks at IAB Tech Lab, which is sort of a sister organization that developed those standards. I think what I'll do is just run through a very brief history, which you probably already know, but maybe some of your listeners don't. When that standard was developed, to your point, there was a little bit of disruption that surrounded it. But the disruption, as you also mentioned, was something that I think was ultimately welcomed just because it was, for the first time, a standard. And the only reason, as I understand it, that IAB even decided to get involved with the process of measuring downloads is because there had been, and people always use this term in relation to podcasting, although it's usually more aligned with the content side of things, but there had been, I guess, in the measurement of podcast downloads, that wild, wild west, right? The proverbial wild, wild west. And you would have some people who were measuring their downloads in one way, and you'd have other people that were measuring another way. And brand advertisers had a difficult time getting a handle on which were the numbers that they could really trust. So the whole reason that Tech Lab stepped in is because, as you also know, podcasting is primarily a download-based form of media. It is not a form of media that typically streams through a media player. And consequently, the MRC, which does a lot of certification and standards building in streaming media, wasn't interested in putting a standard together for podcasting. And so because there was this gap for podcasting, because it was a download-based media that MRC wasn't interested in certifying at that time, IAB wanted to step in for the only reason of trying to bring a little bit of order to the chaos that existed at that time, so that you, again, did not have brand advertisers saying, I don't know if we can trust the medium. We don't know whose download numbers make sense. So one of the roles, to answer your question, that IAB plays in the podcast space is to simply be the organization that works with all the people from across the industry. And I said this on some other podcasts too. It's important to understand that IAB is not handing that standard down from on high, like, it's the tablets from Moses. What we do is simply curate sort of the best ideas from the podcast industry as a whole, which has a great interest collectively in making sure that brand advertisers do trust the numbers that are coming out. And so all we do is work collaboratively through Tech Lab with all the people that are performing measurement in the space to create a standard that people can believe in and that provides confidence to folks in the buying community. And so that is one of the roles that IAB plays in the podcast arena, is having a standard that people look to for the purposes of delivering confidence to buyers of podcast media. The other role that we play at IAB is one that is frankly quite similar to the role that you play in many respects and the role that many other people throughout the ecosystem play. We want at IAB always to bring the buyers and sellers of ad-supported media together for more fruitful partnerships. Now, that's across all forms of media, just not only podcasting. But in the case of podcasting, there has been an increasing focus, in some respects, maybe because I'm so passionate about the space myself and I'm now running the audio practice at IAB, but we are increasingly focused on making sure that we can do further support of and increase profitable partnerships between the buyers and sellers of podcast media. And that is the role that we play in a variety of different ways. We publish, as you pointed out, research on that topic. I've produced several guides since I've been here that are all designed to, again, bring the buyers and sellers of podcast inventory together in ways that are more profitable to their businesses. And basically anything we can do to support growth, we do. We have conferences, we have many meetings of working groups and committees, we have an audio board of directors, and all of these things ladder back to topics of consequence to people working in podcasting, whether that be measurement of advertising effectiveness, understanding and evangelizing podcasters' role within the creator economy, everything from creative executions to run of network sales and, on and on and on. Partnerships with DSPs and anything you can think of, but that we try and support in any way that we can.
Yeah. Awesome. So video podcasts are obviously blowing up. I feel like you can't look at anything in the podcast industry without talking about video. There are going to inherently just be some differences between video and audio. And I think we've increasingly been very reliant on dynamic ad insertion, which I personally am a big fan of. But when we think about video, obviously we can't do dynamic ad insertion. So are there limitations that maybe advertisers aren't considering when thinking about video podcasts?
It's interesting. I don't know that advertisers regard video podcast consumption as a limiting factor. I think what they do for anybody who's used to activating via DAI in the traditional audio-based RSS feed environment, I do think that you have some questions as to how to understand the value of a viewed impression in a space like YouTube or Spotify in comparison to something that they've known for a long time now, right? People are very used to, the buyers that are already leaned into podcasting, and there's not enough of them, but the buyers that are already leaned into podcasting are very used to transacting in a programmatic or a direct sold environment against that RSS feed and, to your point, dynamically inserting ads. They're not as familiar even now with how to think about monetization for YouTube. To your point, up to now, we haven't seen dynamic ad insertion in YouTube, although you may have just seen within the last couple of days, there's some news out there in the media that is talking about an announcement that YouTube just made, which makes it seem as if they are getting ready to, in fact, allow for RSS-style dynamic ad insertion in YouTube, which many people think, or at least talking about how that could be revolutionary. But setting that aside for a moment, up till now, there's not been any DAI for podcast companies on YouTube. And so you are seeing a lot of advertisers trying to figure out, okay, if I know that I cannot do dynamic insertion there, maybe I think a little bit more about, a traditional baked-in placement within that video feed that allows me to monetize that way. But they're still trying to figure out, how do I assess the value of that impression in relation to the impressions I'm used to contracting on in the audio world? And there's a lot still to be shaken out. But I wouldn't necessarily describe it as something where they see it as a limitation. I think they might actually see it as an opportunity. It's a lot of additional incremental reach that they weren't getting before. And so my hope is, and my expectation is, that they will embrace the opportunities that go along with additional opportunities to address audiences on the video and not just the audio side of the coin.
Yeah, absolutely. I just read an interesting blog post by Dan Meisner of Bumper, and he essentially has created platform within Bumper where he's able to bring in the views from YouTube, streams from Spotify, and downloads from Apple to kind of create an overall audience
Right.
number. And I think it's very interesting, but I also feel like it's taking three different sized objects and trying to put them into one. And I don't know that I think that they're the same. What are your thoughts?
Well, this is kind of what I was getting at. I think that people are trying to figure out, again, the relative value of these different touch points, the relative value of these different impressions, precisely because they are obviously not the same. Does that mean that Dan should not be trying to put together like a tool like the one that he's created? Absolutely not. Does it mean
Sure.
that there isn't value associated with a tool like that? No, I think that there is value, but I still think that especially for people in the buying community, there's a lot left to be thought through in terms of figuring out, even if you do aggregate all of that data together, how do you assign relative values to each of those different types of things? And for instance, we were talking a little bit earlier about things that IAB does to try and play a role and support the podcast community. We do, as you probably know, the podcast upfront every year. And at last year's podcast upfront, there was a really interesting panel conversation really about this very topic, right? The idea that especially as podcasting moves into an era where podcast creators are deploying this incredible 360-degree influence, right? We all know that podcasters are the most trusted people out there. We all know that the authenticity and the connection they make with their audience is fertile ground for advertisers to align their brand stories with the personal stories that these podcast creators are telling. But we also know that it's hard to say that the social post that podcast creator might be doing is exactly the same as the ad impression you get dynamically inserted into their actual podcast. We know that there may be a difference in the way that the advertiser views somebody who might be passively sort of experiencing the video side of things, and maybe they're not going to assign quite as high a value to the video baked in ad on YouTube as they would, again, to somebody who's intently listening on their commute to the traditional RSS audio feed. So there's a lot that has to be shaken out. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that. I'm not going to pretend that I know where advertisers are going to land, but I can tell you that in that conversation at the podcast upfront, this is Hala Tal, right, at Yap Media. She led that panel. Do you know Hala? And she was making the very interesting observation that she herself, when she is putting together advertising packages on behalf of the creators within her network, she herself is very, very discriminating about what's the CPM going to be when it's attached to the traditional audio podcast episode versus if that same creator makes a social post, how is that going to be valued? And so I think it's vitally important that people like Dan come up with innovative tools like he's coming up with so that we can get a bigger picture of the total audience that's being brought to bear for podcasters. But obviously, there's a ways to go yet before we understand exactly how people are going to calculate the cumulative value of all those different types of impressions.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that makes a ton of sense. So I guess I'm curious, does the IAB have video standards similar to the way that you have podcast standards?
There are video standards. Again, this is an area that I'm not going to pretend to have an expertise in, but what I will do is point back to the IAB Tech Lab. Anybody who's listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, I don't actually know if we're watching and listening or just listening, but anybody who is experiencing this podcast who wants to learn more about the standards that exist at Tech Lab for things like viewability metrics and video, just go to the IAB Tech Lab website. It is a very well organized site, and you can find all the standards that you need right there. You can do the same thing for that matter for the podcast download technical standards. They're all right there. You can read up, and you don't have to listen to me get it half right, half wrong. You can just download the documentation yourself and take a look at it. But yes, there are standards that exist that many people activate against every day.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. I appreciate that. So I know that ad load has been a big conversation, and I'm curious through any of the research or the things that you've done at the IAB, where do you land on ad load? I think that everybody's saying, oh, it's increasing so much. And my opinion always is that like the very top podcasts, yes, like the top 1% of podcasts, maybe their ad load is quite high, but I feel like the average podcast is probably not as high as we act like it is. Do you have an opinion, or does the IAB help monitor that at all?
The IAB is not monitoring that, and I would not want to speak on behalf of IAB as a whole in giving an opinion about it. My own opinion is somewhat informed by the research that is out there. It is absolutely true, and you can see this with tools like Magellan and Podscribe. It is absolutely true that ad load is rising. Generally speaking, I don't think that it is an emergency level situation, but it is something that obviously a lot of people are paying attention to. Remember, a
Mhm.
couple of years ago, Pierre Bouvard at Cumulus came out with an interesting piece of research. I don't know if you know Pierre, but he does really great deep dives on a variety of important topics to the industry. And I
Mhm.
remember that he was demonstrating, at least at that time, that ad load still ranging in that maybe 5 to 6% level, which is maybe a bit higher than the 3 or 4% it had been a year or two before. He was saying that the research that they were doing, or at least the research he was pointing to, indicated that we were not yet at a point where we were disrupting the listener experience in a way that might impact people's opinion of the medium. But over time, I do think that that sort of special nature of podcasting, what everybody in this industry always talks about, that incredible intimacy, that incredible authenticity, and just like the ability to immerse yourself in a podcast and feel like you're getting really quality content without too much ad interruption. It's something we should keep an eye on. I think it
Mhm.
matters. There are many people who are on the brand or the agency side here at IAB that talk to me about it from time to time, and they say that it does concern them. But I don't sense, at least in the conversations that I'm having, that we have yet reached a point where people are truly worried about it. The listenership is up, the number of people listening is up, and I would assume that if we had already reached a point where we needed to worry a lot about ad load, that we would not continue to see all this listener growth that we're still seeing. So I think we're okay for the moment, but it's something that we should pay attention to.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I think that makes total sense. So, when we look at kind of the scalability, the effectiveness of advertising, we obviously have the host read ad, but we also have an increase in programmatic. What are your thoughts about programmatic advertising in general? And do you think that programmatic advertising is on the rise? Is that something that's been measured?
Well, programmatic advertising is, as you probably know, the overwhelming manner in which people activate in many other forms of media. It is also
For
true to
sure.
say that programmatic advertising is on the rise in podcasting. I happen to think, as I think many are not unique in this regard, I happen to think that there is a very important role for both programmatic advertising and direct sold host read ads.
Agreed.
The phenomenal, I keep saying the word over again. I mean, everybody and their brother says this, but the incredible intimacy and that real connection that podcast creators are making with their audiences is such that you can't really beat the value sometimes of a host read ad when it comes to, again, aligning somebody's personal story as a podcast creator with a brand story that is contextually relevant. That's fantastic. But as we all know, there is so much incredible content across the long tail of podcasting. And as we talk about at conference after conference after conference, we're leaving upwards of 70 to 80% of
Mhm.
the addressable audience in podcasting on the table. Nobody pays attention to it. And there's an incredible, rich opportunity for podcasters to better monetize their content and for advertisers to better align with the consumers of that content if we can get more advertising across that long tail. Programmatic's got a huge role to play there. And I'll just say this too. In my 3 years at IAB now, one of the things that I've become utterly convinced about, not just from the research that I've seen and the conversations that I have, but also from conversations like this one, from conference after conference, it is clear to me that the halo effect of amazing podcast content provides powerful opportunities for advertisers that is not always tied to a voice, to a host read ad, to a host voiced ad, right? Just the simple fact that I love and am passionate about this podcast is going to make me more attentive. I'm listening more closely and more
Yeah.
engaged with, and even if the podcaster in question is not directly voicing an ad about that particular product or service that I'm listening to an ad about, I'm just going to be by definition more leaned in, more engaged, and probably more receptive to that advertising simply because I know it is supporting a show that might not otherwise exist if it wasn't there to support it. There's plenty of evidence out there, as you know, plenty of research that indicates this, but my own just, deep in the bones in my heart feeling is that podcast content is so rich and so powerful and so meaningful to so many people that there's a
Mhm.
role not just for the host read, but for programmatic. And it's good for the podcasters themselves. Podcast creators should and must be discriminating about the types of ads that they're going to take on
For
a
sure.
programmatic basis. You want, especially if you're working, let's say, with a network, then you want to sit down with your network partners if you're a creator. You want to talk about the types of ads that you're willing to have and not willing to have. But you should not regard programmatic, in my opinion, as an automatically bad thing. I think you should regard it instead as an opportunity. And so again, I believe it's a real role for the richness of that beautiful bespoke host-read partnership and also the programmatic advertising you can do to further monetize your content in a way that is, I think, very well received by the people
Mm-hmm.
that are consuming content.
Mm-hmm. I agree with everything you said 100%. I think you hit it spot on. The reality is that we can never monetize every impression, and programmatic really allows us access to that. And so I really love hearing folks like yourself say that it isn't one or the other. It really is both. And I really believe that that's how we can look to really maximize ad dollars from the industry as a whole, is by having that combination.
And don't forget, advertisers generally like the opportunity to dial the controls and find the
Yep.
audiences that they're looking for. And as I said a minute ago, it is so important that the podcast industry as a whole focus ever more stringently on the fact that there's scale and audiences. And one of the things that we try and do at IAB is help advertisers to understand that they shouldn't only think, because some advertisers still do, they should not only think of podcasting as just like the few shows they're familiar with, the few big shows with the many, many downloads, and only put their media dollars there. Because while those are great places to advertise, and while they absolutely give bang for the buck to the advertisers that advertise there, it's so often the smaller shows that have comparatively smaller download counts that have the extra high levels of engagement. And so you
Right.
want to be there. And so we as an industry want to make sure that people understand they don't have to take a show by show approach. They can take the very same going after a particular kind of audience approach that they take in the other forms of media that they're used to buying in. And as soon as we can cross that threshold a little bit more in the minds of advertisers, and they can just see it as this giant scaled industry where they can simply buy audiences and they don't even have to concern themselves quite as much with the exact nature of the shows. They just know that the people they want to reach are there. And they know that because they're there in a podcast environment, they're going to be more attentive and more engaged than they are in other forms of sort of lean back media. My God, that's where we need to be. And that's a big part of the message that we try and bring to the entire digital marketing community at IAB where podcasting is concerned.
Yeah, yeah, love that. I think that that's totally spot on. So I know that this isn't a question that you can answer necessarily,
Okay.
but how do you feel that AI is really going to kind of influence or innovate within the podcast space?
There are so many people who are so much smarter about this kind of topic than I am. However, I have some early feelings about it. And they're not so early at this point. You know, AI has been with us for long enough now that we can start to
Hmm.
see some of the applications, not just to podcasting, but to all media. Where podcasting in particular is concerned, I think the first place that I'd start with is, again, audience. I'd
Hmm.
start with audience. You can use AI to probabilistically identify audience cohorts in ways that brand advertisers want those audiences to be defined. You know, like the folks at Claritas are using AI all the time to sort of put together audience profiles that allow people to invest in podcasting with greater confidence that they'll be able to clear and get the scale that they're looking for.
Hmm.
So I think that's one underappreciated aspect of how AI matters to podcasting. Helping people find audiences from the buy side is an important part of it. On the other side of the coin, which is, I guess, where I'm thinking you're going, you know, AI can be used for everything from figuring out what you want your next 10 show topics to be. You can run a bunch of queries against an AI engine so that you can figure out how to best position your next conversation with your next host, whatever you want that content to be. But for me, where a lot of the really interesting stuff is going to come is on the creative application of AI for advertising creative. You know, there's a lot of questions as to how far we want to lean into creative iteration through the use of AI. But one thing that is clearly beneficial, I think, is that you should be able to use AI to rapidly scale and produce slightly differing versions of ads, and this isn't just for podcasting, in ways that will probably enhance campaign performance for the people that are buying podcast inventory. So that's a big area that I think matters and can be useful to people. What I don't imagine, I could be wrong about this, you could ask people, again, far more knowledgeable than I, what I don't think will happen and what I hope won't happen is that you see too much AI used to actually produce much of an individual podcast episode. But again, to apply AI to creative iterations for the ads that are running on those shows, I think there's a lot of good that may be done there.
Yeah.
I actually have a question for you, because you work with a whole bunch of podcast creators. And so I wonder, and my understanding is that a lot of the advertising that is done on the shows of the creators that you work with is host-read ads. And first of all, am I right about that?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So if I'm right about that, I'm wondering if you're having conversations with the creators that you work with regarding things like the use of their voice, licensing their voice, so that their voice can, for instance, be a synthetic voice generation of a host-read ad. Are these concerns that you have and that your creators have?
It's interesting because I do think that the hosts are inquisitive and, they have a level of interest, but the agencies have definitely come out in a strong way and said that you may not use AI generated voices to produce ad reads. And I mean, of course, not every single agency has done that, but most of the big players have. And I get it for sure, but I think it is a little bit unfortunate in some ways because I do think that if you could produce a host read ad, and as a host, let's say that I'm, doing an ad read for NordVPN, and I could say, all right, I value NordVPN because it allows me to access things outside of where I could access online content. It allows me to protect my privacy, and it just speeds my internet use up, whatever, right? So I could say to this AI system, this is my personal experience. This is what I value. Now take all these talking points and create me a really great 60-second ad read. I don't necessarily see that that's a huge issue. I mean, that's a very risky statement that I just said, because I feel like people will hear that and say, ooh, Heather thinks that all host read ads should be done by AI. And I don't, but I don't think it's as bad in some instances as we're thinking that it is. I also really do think that we should be able to use AI to make small modifications to ads. So let's say a host records a whole ad read, but they get the call to action incorrect, or the call to action needs to be updated in a week, which sometimes it is, right? It's like we get talking points at the beginning of the month, and 2 weeks in or a week in, they say, oh, we decided to change it. Well, instead of totally re-recording the ad, why not just go ahead and say, oh, hey, AI, this needs to be like Podcast Advertising Playbook /40 instead of /30 or whatever. You know what I mean? Like there's so many small things that I think we could be using. I'm not personally a huge fan of the idea of creating AI generated podcasts, period. I kind of feel like the value, in my opinion, of listening to a podcast is that humanity. And I want to get to know a person, not necessarily a computer. But then you could say that there are social media accounts that have been generated by computers that millions of people love and follow. So I think it's very possible that people could love and happily follow an AI generated podcast, period. But for my personal opinion, that's what I think.
Yeah, it's funny. I may be the only person left on earth who doesn't really engage with social media, but I know that there are sort of AI generated social accounts that people follow. But for my money, I do think that there's a distinction to be made in the minds of most media consumers between something like that and something like an AI generated podcast. And what I mean by that is what you said. It goes back to what you said. There is an expectation, I think, that you are making a human connection when you're listening to a podcast. And so I think that sure, technology may get to be so good that maybe people don't even realize that they're listening to an AI generated podcast one day. But as a general rule, my assumption is that there would be a preference for something that feels more real. But I also agree with you regarding the advertising. I do think that there are limited select opportunities for the use of AI to simply make it easier to do things that would ordinarily take a very, very long time to do, to get done. right?
Hmm.
And I think, for instance, if you had a host who was, to your point, doing 90% of the read, but on the margins 10% were updated because of updated calls to action, I think that would be probably acceptable to most people. And then again, it's a benefit to the ecosystem because it just means that you can produce more
Speed.
effective advertising that
Mhm.
helps the creators monetize and the advertisers, get the return that they're looking for. So I do think that you will continue to see that. And some of it's already happening, right? I mean, there's plenty of folks that are probably taking advantage of companies like A Million Ads, where so much of the advertisement is sort of assembled on the fly, depending on is it raining today or what DMA are you in, those
Right.
kinds of things, and all that stuff is happening because of machine intelligence behind the scenes. And so again, you want to be smart and intelligent and cautious about pushing the margins too far, but you also want to be very open to the opportunities that some of these efficiencies present.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I was thinking about AI this weekend, and I'm really fascinated by how it's going to change marketing, period. And I just think that I use ChatGPT now so much for so many things. And you know, what if I decide I want to go out to dinner, or what if I decide that, I need to buy a winter coat for my trip to Chicago next week, or what if I decide I want to buy a car? Like, how easy is it just to go in and say, these are the parameters, right? So I want a coat that's this size, that's made of
Yeah.
this material, that's going to arrive by Wednesday. Find me that perfect coat. And
Yeah.
oh, it's just going to arrive at my doorstep on Wednesday. And I'm really curious to see how that's going to impact marketing, period. Like, obviously, Google Ads had a big impact when all of a sudden it was like, oh, hey, I'm going to search for something, but this ad's going to come up first and I'm going to get priority to that. And I do really believe that AI is going to change our lives in ways that we don't even fathom at this moment, just as the internet changed our lives so drastically when it emerged. But I really do think it could have a very drastic impact on the advertising industry. How do you see the IAB as taking a role in that? And do you have any idea where you even start with something as massive as that?
I love everything you just said. I love the question, and I don't know that I can even wrap my mind around how massive it is, but I will start small. I will say this much. I think that AI is not only something which we can't imagine the ways that it's going to impact us, I think it has already affected us in ways that we can't even fully appreciate now.
Sure.
And just to give a really simple example as it pertains to advertising, I think something you said 3 or 4 minutes ago is already happening, right? So you made the comment that you could sit down and you could put in the parameters and use something like, a series of queries with an AI agent to produce ad copy. I think that there probably are people who are doing that today. Are they necessarily then going on to use something like synthetic voice to actually voice the ad? Maybe not. Maybe they're then presenting that script to a podcast creator and then they're like reading that. But I think probably a lot of ad copy these days probably has at least pieces of things that were
Sure.
drawn from AI. And people aren't even thinking about how just automatically we are doing that sort of thing in our day-to-day life. That's the small place where I would start. The bigger place that I would go is that you're right. It's going to be dramatic change, not just for society in general, but for obviously advertising. And we just literally this week hired at IAB a vice president in charge of AI. We had never had one here before. And that is, I think, a sign to you that it is going to be abundantly important to the industry. We do these kinds of things because we hear from membership that this is an area where they want support. This is an area where they
Sure.
want clarity. This is an area where they want research and an opportunity to come together to talk to one another and do shared learning. And we heard about it often enough over the course of the last 6 months to a year that we now have a vice president of AI. I will just tell you anecdotally something that really makes me think about where advertising is going to go with AI. I mean, obviously, everybody knows coming off the Super Bowl that there were ads produced entirely in the visual realm with AI. And you're going to start to see, again, that creative iteration experience with AI, not just like the creation of something that is static, but the creation of something that can live and breathe and change. And so I was just talking, as a matter of sheer coincidence, earlier today with the person who just came here as the new VP of AI. And I was talking to her precisely because I was interested in maybe having her talk about some of the synthetic voice implications at the next meeting of the audio board of directors. But we got into a much broader conversation about something that I remember reading about 2 years ago. And this is a campaign that was run by Group M and I think Wavemaker, which I believe is a unit of Group M. And it was like in India. And it was a case study based on what happened during the pandemic. And as we know, all around the world, this country and other countries, people were shut down and small businesses were just being decimated because nobody was going out and they weren't shopping at the malls and they weren't shopping in person the way that they were. And so Wavemaker did this campaign where I forget what the name of the actor is, but there's some incredibly well-known actor in India who everybody loves. And they used AI to record, I don't know, 5-10 seconds of him talking. And then they did like 1,500 different, I'm probably getting the number wrong, but like hundreds, if not thousands of different versions of ads that were all about, hey, you want to buy this shoe? Come on down to and then it would be inserting the local mall, that shop at that mall. And then if you were in a different part of the country, it would be like finishing up again, your call to action, your tag at the end. It would be like this shop in this mall. And he didn't voice any of it. And it wasn't even just audio, it was his face. And they had mapped using the AI, all the different, and you couldn't tell. It was utterly seamless. I mean, this isn't for your podcast audience, but if you want, I'll just send you the link to the study. It's really interesting. But that is already happening. That was 2 years ago. And then again, everybody saw what happened during the Super Bowl. So obviously AI is going to profoundly impact the ways in which we advertise, and it's going to profoundly interact the ways in which we seek, gather, and process information as human beings.
Yeah.
So it is remarkable. I think that we're all impacted already at a level that we don't even appreciate.
Yeah,
like to your point, I'm using ChatGPT all the time now, and I don't even think about it.
Yeah,
like how much of that came from ChatGPT, and how much came from my brain? I don't even know anymore.
No, but it's so great because it cuts things in half in terms of like, especially for me, just written documents, right? Like you can go in and say, hey, I want X, Y, and Z, and it spits it out, and then you can edit it, which is so much easier to edit something than create it from scratch. So it's really, really fascinating. Well, I know we need to start wrapping it up, but I have one other, I feel, important question that I want to ask you. I made a post a few weeks ago about how awful I think the terminology is in the podcast industry, because it seems like everybody uses their own words to mean different things. And I know that Brian and the Sounds Profitable team have released a glossary of terms. I don't know how many people actually use it, but where does the IAB stand, or does the IAB play a role in coming up with commonly used terminology within the industry?
Well, I'll just stick with podcasting for the moment. And there's some debate as to whether or not even, how Tech Lab has defined a podcast impression ought to be the way in which an impression in podcasting is defined.
Right.
IAB, as a general rule, is a reflection of membership. And so what we try to do is sort through what appears to be the most useful way to define and describe things, and then do what we can to support people's understanding of those broad definitions. But even here at IAB, we recognize that there are people saying things and doing things in different ways, and that even people who had all largely agreed that something should be considered this way for the last 6 years might suddenly change 2 weeks later and decide we want to view it this way. So I can't say that IAB plants its flag in the ground to be an absolutist about terminology. I do think that there is a role for any organization that seeks to support the digital marketing community to rally people around certain ways of discussing things. But I don't know that we would ever sort of decree by judicial fiat that it must be this way, because you do have to allow for the fact that some people are going to represent things a little differently than others. If you could give me like a specific real world example of what you're talking about, then maybe I could ladder it back to a precise thing that we have at IAB. But that's sort of like my broad viewpoint.
I think that's a good explanation. So like, for instance, I was talking to, an industry colleague the other day, and we have baked in ads and we have embedded ads, and then we have episodic ads, and then we have faked in ads, and then we have integrated insertions, and it's like, what exactly do all of those things mean? And in this particular conversation, we were talking about an integrated ad as being a baked in or an embedded ad. And he had communicated that they call it an integrated ad. And I was like, why in the world would we do that? We've been calling this a baked in ad for the last 15 years,
Okay, now I understand what you're saying. Okay, so here's my feeling. This has nothing to do with podcasting or IAB or internet advertising. It has to do with human beings.
Sure.
And the unfortunate reality is that human beings are a creative lot. That's not an unfortunate thing usually, but in this particular context, is that what I mean is that people are just going to say things and they mean something different than what they're saying, or maybe they mean what you're saying, but they're just saying it a slightly different way. And so for me, it is sometimes a fool's errand to try and just say, this is what everybody should call this and only this. Instead, what I like to do is, like, no matter what you call it, just make sure people understand the value proposition of whatever that thing is. So you want to call it integrated, you want to call it embedded, you want to call it baked in, doesn't matter. Just make sure that the conversation takes into account the fact that this is a really special, in the voice of the host kind of an experience, and you should value it accordingly. So I almost don't care what you call it, as long as people understand what the value associated with it is, and then you can transact on that basis. Because otherwise you're just going to get, like you said, in this like terrible loop of, well, but you call it this and I want you to call it that, and they're never going to call it that. So just
right.
You still have people, trying to figure out exactly what the definition of impression is, not just specific to podcasting, but in all media. So as long as people understand the broad experience of whatever it is they're trying to achieve and with the value associated with the tactics that they're taking, that's the conversation you want to be having, I think.
Yeah. No, I think that that's good advice. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show today. So I know you've discussed a couple of different resources that the IAB has available. So if somebody's listening, which I would guess they are not, but if somebody is listening who has never heard of the IAB, they want to access your resources, where would be a good place for them to go?
They can just go to IAB.com and they can search just on the word podcasting and things will pop up, or search on the word audio and things will pop up. I will say one thing that we were pretty proud to produce last year, and this is easy to find. You can just Google this and it'll come up as, I'm sure, the top result in Google. But we produced a guide last year called Podcasting in the Creator Economy. And as the name suggests, the whole reason we wanted to do that was to remind people that if you are a marketer with an influencer marketing dollar to deploy, you need to think long and hard about how much of that dollar you want to deploy in podcast advertising, because in the context of the creator economy, you can't find anybody more influential or more impactful than podcast creators. So we tried to do that against it. We had released last year, IAB writ large, a study about the creator economy, and it was a largely, sort of visual video focused document. And we wanted to make sure in the IAB Media Center that everybody paid some special attention to podcasting, which of course is an increasingly video consumed medium, but just generally the idea of podcasting as being a really special thing within the context of the creator economy. We wanted to, and there's a lot of really great information in there. You had mentioned Sounds Profitable. We got some great data from them in there, but all sorts of data, and just what we hope was a unique sort of case study based depiction of the beauty of podcasting and why it's so important for the buyers and sellers of that unique medium to come together.
Excellent. Love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Matt.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Sounds good. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope that you have enjoyed it as much as I have. If you're not familiar with the IAB, please do go check out some of the resources that they have. Really some valuable tools there. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.